Good morning, afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone to our APRU Asia Pacific Women in Leadership Mentoring Program seminar, The Art of Effective Communication and Negotiation. My name is Joanna Regulska. I'm Vice Provost and Dean of Global Affairs, and I'm also a Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies here at UC Davis. I have a pleasure of serving as APWiL co-chair, and I really want to welcome all of you very warmly, and thank you so much for joining us. Across the three cohorts now of our APWiL Mentoring Program, which is part of the APRU initiative and consortium, we've heard from many of our participants that the topic of communication and negotiation in leaderships are actually very important to the grow as leaders. And in fact, many of the goals set up by mentees in the program involve communication in some form. And our mentors have been terrific in supporting our mentees in achieving those goals and engaging actually and learning from each other what is the good form of an effective communication. So we are very happy to be here together to really hear from three leaders from across the Pacific Rim about their experiences and also share their thoughts and advice on this very important topics for many of us. We are also excited to hear the various perspectives brought by your colleagues from a variety of backgrounds, location, and disciplines. And we look forward really to sort of informal networking that follows this seminar so that we can continue processing what we have learned together. Today, we'll have a moderated panel of speakers followed by Q&A, and that we should have at least 30 minutes of our time together for an informal networking session using our break room, which we always do. And we know from the experience that actually it works very, very well. Now, I would like to take the opportunity and really introduce our moderator for today's workshop, who is Professor Stephanie Shamila-Pillay. She is a professor at the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics at the University of Malaya in Malaysia. She was previously the Dean of the Faculty and Chair of the Social Advancements and Happiness Research Cluster at the University of Malaya. And previously, she headed the University Center for Industry and Community Linkage. At present, Professor Pillay is a mentor in the third cohort of our famous Asia Pacific Women in Leadership Program. She is pioneering member of the Malaysian chapter of International Dean's Course, where she actually led many sessions on effective communication, as has thus far mentored 10 participants from very different disciplines over the two cohorts of the Malaysian chapter of International Dean's Course. So thank you so much, Professor Pillay, for joining us and for moderating this session.
Thank you. Most welcome, and thank you very much to Joanna. And hello, everyone. I'm sure that you are as excited as me for today. And as Joanna mentioned, we have brought three amazing leaders together today to share their experiences and wisdom on communication and negotiation in leadership. And each of our speakers today will tell us about a time that they used communication and negotiation skills as a leader, and share with us what they have found to be most effective in such context. So it's going to be a very personal session, and I'm sure you'll have lots of questions later. So they will share important lessons that they've learned about communication in leadership, especially taking into account that leaders in today's world especially work in and across diverse audiences and issues. But before we begin, if you do have questions, please feel free to type in the chat. And once all the three speakers have finished speaking, then I will open the Q&A session so that we don't interrupt the flow of the session and the speakers. So, I'm so excited and nervous at the same time because of our amazing lineup that we have today. But let me introduce our very first speaker today. That's Associate Professor Dr. Jemima Tia Siao, and she is currently Pro Vice Chancellor Pacific, Waipapa Tamatha Rao, University of Auckland. She was previously the co-head of school, Tewanaga o Waipapa, School of Maori Studies and Pacific Studies, Faculty of Arts, Waipapa Tamatha Rao, University of Auckland. She is of Samoan descent with a public and community health background. Now, her expertise lies primarily in Pacific Studies, Pacific health, mental health and well-being, suicide prevention and postvention, health inequalities, climate change, and youth development. Now, that's a lot of different issues that I'm sure we'll hear about some of them today. And Associate Professor Tia Siao is also a current mentor in the third cohort of the APWiL Mentoring Program. So over to you, Dr. Tia Siao.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Stephanie. I really appreciate that. So kia ora, from Aotearoa, Auckland, New Zealand, talofa lava, from Samoa. So first of all, I'd like to thank the organisation and organisers for the invitation. It got me thinking a lot actually around this because it's quite complex, negotiating and effective communication. Obviously, that would mean a lot. It would be different in different circumstances. And the first thing that came to my mind in my reflections was, well, what is negotiation? What is effective leadership? And for me personally, the top leadership priority is authenticity. That's my number one thing, and trusting yourself and the broad overall vision and the purpose, right? So I thought I would bring that to the forefront and work my way backwards as to what negotiation means for me in leadership. I consider that it's negotiating often found in rooms and spaces where the majority of, say, the room doesn't look like somebody like me. And so I feel that authenticity and respect for your peers and your colleagues has always helped me in these situations. And by this, I mean being a Pacific person, a New Zealand-born Pacific person in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and having to, I guess, negotiate spaces in amongst the recognition of our tangata whenua, or our First Nations people, that's the Māori, then the diverse Pacific groups within Pacific, that, you know, we're not homogenous. And then, of course, all this within a Western-dominated framework. So negotiating these multiple spaces can somewhat be hat swapping most days, if not all day. And I found that that's really been beneficial in terms of my own leadership, because it's helped me to center myself and find myself and anchor myself to be able to, once again, be my authentic self in these spaces. And with that comes a trusting of oneself. We all go through it. That what do you call it? Someone chime in. Oh, you know what I'm trying to say. So navigating Te Ao Māori worldviews, that's Indigenous peoples, multiple Pacific worldviews, and once again, as I said, the dominant worldview. And so I tend to ask myself in these meetings, in these negotiating of instances, is everything I do and say mana enhancing? And mana in New Zealand, in the Māori language, and of course across most of the Pacific, mana is about the embodiment of status, empowerment, prestige, everything that makes you who you are. And with that comes this respect. So I find that if it's not mana enhancing, then it shouldn't be, it's not a pleasurable negotiating space, nor is it safe. I've also been subject to vile vitriol and racism, even in my leadership role, and I think that will take some time, and I don't mean within my institution, I mean from external stakeholders. And so trying to navigate that, being a leader and trying to find the balance of biting my tongue and respecting, I don't want to turn up to work the next day with a terminated contract. But what I'm saying is balancing that, but also being the voice for those who are usually underserved and those voices that have normally been muffled. And so I find that this negotiation is quite draining and tiresome. But the positive side is that it brings this element to my leadership that perhaps not everyone is afforded. Now, in terms of effective communication, I have within my team, for example, there's a fellow administrator. This person looks after bookings, just bookings. And then you have my assistant pro vice chancellor, who's my 2IC, all the way to my line manager, who is my vice chancellor. Now, if I can deliver the same message, but it has to be obviously in various and diverse ways, it's meeting people and seeing them eye to eye. And I found that listening to the people has been hugely, hugely significant in the way that I message, and whatever messaging that may be. Are the people I'm trying to reach comprehending what I'm saying? I can't assume that. I come with my own biases as well. I cannot assume that everyone is on the same wavelength. And so languaging matters. It really does matter, whether that's with students, whether that's with your peers, key stakeholders, and of course your communities, which I do also a lot of work with. And knowing when to be transparent and when to protect. And by that, I mean, I'm always transparent. You need to be trusted and you need to be trustworthy. And so transparency is very important to me. But by the same token, also being very protective of my team. There are some things they shouldn't need to know because, well, it could negatively impact on their mental health and well-being. So in a nutshell, I think that's about what I can share on my experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very personal sharing, of you as a Samoan woman, but also as a leader. And I think that conflict, we'll talk about it later, but because I want to introduce the next speaker. And then our next speaker is none other than Dr. Renata Garrison-Tao, and she is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the University of California, Davis. And before joining UC Davis in 2019, Dr. Tao was Associate Vice Provost for Strategic Initiatives at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, or UMBC, and Professor of the Practice in UMBC's College of Engineering and IT. An international speaker on global diversity in STEM, Dr. Tao has led discussions around the world on topics such as inclusive engagement, engineering for all, cultivating inclusive excellence within science, engineering, and technology, work-life balance, family and prevention of domestic and workplace abuse. Now, she is also, of course, a very strong supporter of the APWiL Mentoring Program with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, serving as a co-leader for the program at UC Davis. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Tao. Over to you.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be involved today as a speaker. And thank you to my fellow speakers. I always love these spaces because I get a chance to sit back and learn as well. And I really appreciated our last distinguished speaker and was just thinking about all the things that she was saying and sharing. And I'm looking forward to hopefully building maybe on some of the things that she was able to share. So as you heard in my introduction, I'm an engineer by training. And so there are some things that I'm going to share today that I think are hopefully helpful based on how I have experienced them in a US context. And I am sharing again as a person who is in engineering, which had been fairly, I should say, definitely a male-dominated field, and in a U.S. context where I am a visible Black woman, and different things that I have had to utilize and go through, and sort of how I have navigated my particular career. So I'm going to do this in a couple of steps, and I hope that that is helpful. First of all, I would like to share a little bit of my background just in terms of steps and positions so that you can see the trajectory. And then I'm going to perhaps share how I use negotiation to get from one step to the other. So I went to graduate school at Northwestern University, and which is in Illinois in the United States, in the central part of the United States, and then a postdoctoral position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is in the northern central portion of the United States. I then became a faculty member and a professor of communication sciences and disorders with a position in engineering, in an engineering lab. I worked at a tech startup for a little while that was actually run by my husband. So I left academia entirely to work in the tech innovation field. I came back to academia as an administrator in a director role, then later assistant dean, later associate vice provost, and then expanded that role, associate vice provost, from just one school to working in a system with 12 universities, and then moved to UC Davis, which is a very large institution of about 39,000 students. So when I think about negotiation as a leader, I think the first thing that I'd like to share is a story that I have when I was hired in my first administrative role. The role was a role for being an associate director of a grant-funded program in Maryland. And I remember very clearly, once I had gone through all of the interview processes and I was in the negotiation phase, they told me that the role was for an associate director. So I asked if I could, instead of being associate director, if my title could be director. And they said, well, you're just starting out, and usually director is reserved for something that you will be, moving toward. You're going to start at associate director and you're going to move to director later, basically after you've proven yourself. So I asked them if they were planning to hire a director over me. Were they planning to hire anyone else, or was I the top person in this particular job who's going to be doing that job? And they said yes. And I said, well, I think I can do my job better if I have the title of director, because then all the constituents will know that I'm in charge of the program. And I think that I will feel more empowered to be able to be successful in the job and leverage the resources if I have the title director instead of associate director. So they considered that to be a viable argument, and I started the position as director. So that was my sort of first lesson in negotiation. I negotiated not necessarily a difference in salary, but a difference in title, because I wanted to be able to access more spaces. I wanted to be able to leverage more resources in order to do the job that I was hired to do, which was to start a program from scratch based on grant-funded mandates to increase numbers and diversity of graduate students that were going to be on my campus. The second thing that I did was, we all have evaluation processes every year. So in my evaluation process every year, my annual evaluation, at the end, I always put in what I wanted to do next in X number of years. So I would say in 3 to 5 years, I would like my next job to be. And I started this from the very beginning. And that sort of started a process of my manager, who at the time was the associate dean and later became the dean of graduate studies. It started the process of them knowing that I did have aspirations and that I was going to be moving in a direction that would lead me there. And I would always ask the question, do I have the skill set to be able to move into that position of my aspiration? And if they said no, then I would say, what do I need to do? And is there something that I need to do so that you would feel comfortable putting me in a position to get the skills that I need to be in that position. And that might mean being on a committee. Were they confident in my skills enough to be on a committee to represent them so that I could build the skills? Were they confident in me enough to give me some funding to go to a conference, to have that investment? Were they confident enough in me to give me an opportunity to take a course somewhere and pay for it so that it would give me the more skills? Now, what I learned from that in terms of skill building and upskilling for leadership programs, for conferences, that not all the things that I wanted to do that I thought would give me the skills that I need were things that were within the strategic plan of the university or unit. And so some things I had to pay for myself. Some things I had to save money for, use vacation time for, and do it myself. So there are a couple of classes that I took. Interestingly enough, there are a couple of trips that I took to different places that were in places that I wanted to go to upskill for connecting to global communities, which at the time was not part of my job description, but it was something that I wanted to do. So I used vacation time and things like that for my own professional development. Talked it over with my family if I needed to be away. I spent time in Ecuador, for example, for 3 weeks. I spent time in Costa Rica for about a month, but paid for some of that out of my own pocket so that I could get some of the skills that I thought that I needed to get. The third thing was when it came to asking for a raise and negotiating for salary equity, I looked at all of the publicly available salaries so that I could see whether or not I was falling within the right areas, and then I could use that as data for my negotiation. When it comes to skills that are effective, I would say being research oriented, researching the position that I had and researching the position that I wanted to have, and making sure that I had all the different sort of listings and attributes connected to both so that I knew where I was going. I had a very clear path connected to where I was and where I wanted to be. I had to be honest about where I wanted to go and talking to people about it. I found that language was very important. So this is also about communication skills. I found that being very clear and telling my supervisors and others, especially when asked, that yes, I wanted to be an assistant dean, or yes, I wanted to be an associate dean. I avoided terms like, I'm happy to help, or I'm here to assist you with what you need, because I realized that by using passive terminology, that it would put me in a helping role and not necessarily in a role to be considered for the actual position. The third thing was being honest about my gaps. What kinds of things did I need to improve upon? Did I need to improve upon financial acumen? And the answer was yes. There were things that I needed to do related to budgeting that I didn't either understand as clearly or that I just needed improvement on. And so I needed to be honest about that and figure out how I could do that. Offering solutions on what I needed to do to upscale, and then understanding the organization and how to move forward. And then finally, thinking about lessons learned, understanding the needs and expectations of the audience. And we heard that from the former speaker. Not shirking or hiding from difficult issues, and then not underestimating the power of having side conversations with people and building relationships. So I'll stop there so we can hear from our other speakers. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tal. And I mean, that was so inspiring, and definitely many lessons to be learned from your own experience. And I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I have to move on because we do have another speaker, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our final speaker for today, Professor Dr. Thomas Schneider. There he is. Hi, Professor Schneider. And he studied at the University of Zurich, the University of Basel, and also, I'm not going to try pronouncing this in French, so I'm just going to say EPHE.
Right.
He earned his degrees, which were all in Egyptology from the University of Basel. So throughout his career, Professor Schneider has held academic and administrative positions in 4 global regions, and these are North America, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. And he has acquired significant leadership experience at the departmental level. Among these are he was acting department chair, he was director of graduate studies, and chair of Egyptology. At the university level, of course, he served as president international at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen, China from 2018 to 2020. And from 2021 to 2022, Professor Schneider was the founding executive director of the Pacific Alliance of Liberal Arts Colleges. And he has been a consultant, adjudicator, and reviewer for universities, funding agencies, and publishers in Australia, China, Europe, Israel, and North America. So vast global experience here. And he has served as an executive editor of academic periodicals. Professor Schneider's own scholarship focuses on cultural and linguistic interconnections in the Near East and environmental history of Egypt and the history of the humanities in Nazi Germany. And he was recently elected as APRU's 5th chief executive, a role which he took up from January 2023. So over to you, Professor Schneider.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Thanks for the very kind words of introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. And I hope I can present a different, perspective on some of what I have learned throughout my experience. And I would like to focus a bit more on the question of how to communicate and negotiate effectively cross-culturally, because that is something that I have felt was a long learning process. And I want to both not discourage, but to understand, attendees that I think this is a lifelong learning process shaped by experiences of alienation, failures, misunderstandings, and rather slowly, I feel also understanding and the surprise of success. So I think that's something that everybody has to accept, that this is not something that happens overnight, but something that we need to be involved in and to learn. So as all of us know, we are all shaped in our interactions with others by ethnocentristic ideas, by stereotyping other cultures, but also by actual cultural differences, by conflicting values, by different habits that we encounter. And I think it's important to understand that we are subject to them, even if we try to be objective and neutral, and that they also apply to our counterparts that we encounter in our conversations, as much as we might expect them to be objective and neutral. So just to give you an idea, from my personal background, I've moved multiple times in my life, from Germany to Switzerland, to France, to Great Britain, to Canada, to China, now to Hong Kong. Through my Polish wife, I spent significant time in Eastern Europe, and through my academic profession, you heard that I'm an Egyptologist, also in the Middle East. I found always that there's a distinct sense of national exclusiveness or exclusivity in Europe. In France, we students from elsewhere tried to navigate the French habits of interaction. In Great Britain, we foreign professors bonded to find a way through the intricacies of the British culture. Only in Canada, as a country of immigrants, a similarly distinct sense of inclusion across the different cultural origins was something that I felt for the first time. And even in the last years, when the country embarked on a momentous process of reconciliation with the First Nations, I still feel that there's a strong sense of wanting to build a common identity across the entire country. When I worked in China, I had the encouraging experience that ethnic boundaries that are seen as immutable in other parts of the world can entirely disappear. I just want to give you an example from my first week across the border in Shenzhen. There was a conflict situation, and it involved a student from one of the countries in South Africa, and she put her arm alongside mine and said, "But you see, I'm pitch black, you are white. How can it be that we have similar experiences here in China?" And then we basically went down a list, and we were astonished that we experienced the same, what she felt was discrimination, like in daily life situations in Shenzhen. And first, it was astonishing for her to see that, you know, we had these boundaries didn't exist that exist in other parts of the world, and also to understand this was not necessarily discrimination, but more a shyness of interacting with foreigners because it could put people in a difficult communication situation. And so I think that was important. And increasingly, I assumed the role of a mediator, I would say a translator between different cultures. So people would come, stop me in the hallway before the meeting with the Chinese delegation, say, but how can we go about things, you know, to achieve a result? So I think it's important here to, for all of you to realize that there are culture-specific purposes of communication and very different habits of how to communicate. I just want to give you a couple of examples here. So one of the distinctions I encountered oftentimes in China was that there is a distinction between business-oriented and relationship-oriented communication. And this was a frequent point of really significant misunderstanding when it came to the encounter of delegations, university delegations, and also the meetings of senior officers. Western delegations would normally view a meeting with their Chinese counterparts as an outright opportunity to get down to business. And they would start right away with, you know, discussing business items. For the Chinese side, conversations were primarily an opportunity to build the relationship. And they would, members of their delegation would ask members of their management team then to follow up on what they would see as business. But that was not part of the major, like the first meeting or so that would be set up between the two sides of the world. And so different priorities entirely. And it was difficult to see that the delegations mostly did not understand that they came to the table with very different priorities. So I also witnessed this similarly in the Middle East. I just give you one anecdote here. I recall a failed communication situation between a Chinese university president and his Western counterpart. The Western president had worked through the business plan on the plane and tried outright to get, you know, the work agenda done during the meeting, whereas his Chinese counterpart attempted time and again to engage in casual conversation with his Western president in an attempt to enhance the personal relationship with his colleague. So this was a failed communication situation. They were talking at cross purposes instead of talking cross-culturally. So I found this quite interesting. And another essential aspect of cross-cultural communication is the way I think how content is communicated. I think here it was important for me to realize that there are really social restrictions and expectations of what can be said directly and what must be left unsaid in certain situations, at least in a public context. And a public context is given when there is more than the two people communicating with each other are present, such in a group meeting. So, for example, I moved to different countries and also I became a different person over time, I must say. So in countries like Germany, but I no longer feel very German, it is, for example, a sign of professionalism to speak clearly and leave no room for misinterpretation, to the extent that the communication can come across as very blunt and insensitive to people who come from a different context. In countries like China, problems may be communicated more indirectly and with a view to preserve one's face and avoid confrontation, preserve harmony. And this is also my impression, even when it comes to comparing different European countries. Switzerland is more harmony-driven than Germany. Canada is more harmony-driven than the US. So even there are sometimes these situations of conflict. So the indirect approach may be perceived as imprecise and not getting to the bottom of things, and people might live unsatisfied by those meetings by those who are accustomed to open communication. But again, leaving things unsaid can help preserve a good relationship. So I think, you know, it's really a complex situation that can unfold and materialize in such meetings. So an additional element also in a meeting situation, and that was mentioned by some of my previous speakers, is also that there's almost always a power hierarchy present in meetings because people from different levels of the hierarchy are present. And so it is difficult also in terms of your own career to say everything that you might want to say, because you have to be careful and protective of your own position. And this is something I have experienced across my entire career. Now, I just wanted to close also with giving some recommendations on how to effectively communicate and some strategies. So I think there's a passive approach. So the passive approach normally would involve tolerance and patience, and keep an open mind towards how the purpose of communication and the way of communicating can differ widely in a cross-cultural situation. There's also an active approach, and this could be to adopt a way of communication and negotiation that takes into account how the other side might or might not communicate. And I'm feeling this is something like an exploratory process, even if you are in a communication situation. It is a forth and back. You see what comes back, how to respond. Then it's a feedback loop where you assess what your interlocutor says, and then you tie this into how you respond and in your attempts to communicate. In the case of the presidents, yes, Chelsea, I'm coming to the end. In the case of the presidents I mentioned before, the right approach would have been for the Western president to realize that relationship building is important for the Chinese counterpart and say, okay, let's devote the first 15 minutes to building the relationship. They had half an hour. And then the Chinese president should have understood that the present president wants to work down the agenda items, and he should have said, well, after 15 minutes, we can talk business, right? So it's often also like a compromise that, you know, the two sides need to find each other in between. And it's important sometimes to take on the role of a mediator rather than to stick to one's viewpoint. So just to rephrase the famous saying, to err on the side of caution, I would say it is better to err on the side of communication. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Schneider. The importance of cross-cultural communication, and one of the important things I got from you is, you know, to be prepared and to have the knowledge of who you're dealing with, so that you don't go in with stereotypical views, number one, and number two, you know, you don't go in with your own demands and your own perspectives. And I think I also got that from Dr. Tal about, you know, being prepared to negotiate. I was going to say fight, but in some situations we do have to fight, but to negotiate for what you want, it means being prepared to know what you want, and knowing what your future is like, and setting it out, getting yourself prepared, knowing what your maybe weaknesses are, or where you lack some information. And it's the same with, I think, with intercultural, multicultural communication. And many of us, Jemima also, Dr. Tia also mentioned, you know, that we deal really in multiple spaces and in multiple layers of our organization, of our communities, and we do have our own guiding principles coming from maybe our own personal beliefs, our own spiritual beliefs, our own ethnic or community beliefs, and that sometimes can be in kind of like, there's a tension sometimes within that and your leadership roles at the university, at the community. So many points and so many things that I want to ask. And I'd like to open the floor to question and answers. And so feel free to type your questions. And while we wait for, I think everyone was so busy listening that they haven't typed their questions, but I do have some questions that some people had asked previously when they registered. So I'm going to start with that, and then I will see if there are questions on the chat, and Adriana will also help me with that. So the first question that we had, which actually I think it's kind of interesting, because and any one of you feel free to address this question. The person asked, how can I keep my temper, you know, when I'm discussing and negotiating what the other person is saying? And I think we found this is conflict management, perhaps, right? So what the other person is saying is really like getting us. And I think Jemima also mentioned like biting your tongue, you know. So how do you keep, you know, you showing your anger and from not just saying things? Any tips on that? So please feel free to maybe who would like to kick us off with this answer? I think I'll go to Jemima, because Jemima mentioned biting your tongue. Yeah. Right.
And by that, I did not by any means mean censoring yourself.
Yeah.
Because that would obviously work against being authentic. But I think in any situation where there is, you shouldn't really approach any situation with anger. There needs to be a pause and a thoughtful process, because at times that could be to the detriment of what you're actually trying to do. It could work against you. And no one wants to be in a room filled with toxicity, nor the talking over each other, or the bad energy. And I've come to realize that anger will get you nowhere. You can be methodical and authoritative and absolutely sure in yourself if there's a calmness and a trust, but also a high trust with your colleagues.
Yes, I think that's the respect you were talking about, right? So self-respect also, and also respect for others. Renata, do you have anything to add to this?
Just really quickly, I think that whether it's in negotiation or conversations and things like that, if there are things that you can think about in advance and anticipate what responses are going to be based on the audience, based on their experiences and their points of view, then there might be an opportunity to circumvent at least your reaction, because you already know how they might react. So you can already manage, if you will, some of those emotions. There might be a need for a little bit of righteous indignation in the right way, in a calm and respectful way, just to show that if you think that there might need to be a change of thought or some understanding. But I think anticipating rather some of the conflict ahead of time can be very helpful.
Thank you, Renata. I think that's
Yes.
a really good point. And Thomas, you want to add to that?
Yes, I just want to, because I have experienced many of these situations, like from, for example, in a departmental context or so. There are always reasons to be upset and angry, but some of these reasons are very personal and are caused by a sense of being treated in an unfair way, maybe by certain policies or certain developments. And, I just want to say, of course, every person is entitled to have his or her standpoint, but also emotions are never a good foundation for coming to a solution. So I think it's always good to step one step back, and sometimes also just to think about, if I looked at this situation from outside, so not from the precise reasons that have made myself angry about a certain development or so. How would an outsider look at the situation in a more objective way? And sometimes it just can, as my speaker said, it can just be helpful to maybe even postpone a discussion to a later point when people have calmed down a little bit and have had time to be more composed and to reflect. Correct. And so I think that's certainly a good approach.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that's very, very useful. And I've being prepared, I think, is one of the key things. If you can, going in with your facts and figures and just remaining calm. But I like still showing if you're not happy with something, but in a respectful way. Now I think we have a question from Nadia. Nadia raised her hand, so maybe you can unmute yourself, Nadia, and ask your question.
Thank you. This is sort of a follow-up question to the question that you read from the pre-questions. And I will confess, I don't know enough about kind of the culture in Malaysia and New Zealand. In the US, there is definitely a trope about angry Black women, it's kind of expanded to the angry brown woman. So I super appreciate the idea that we need to be transparent and authentic. At the same time, some people can view us with a lens of, if we are being candid or very direct, it's perceived as aggressive or whatever. And I'm curious if you have any strategies for kind of learning how to defect that lens so we can show up as our authentic selves without being labeled as
Yeah.
angry just because
Yeah.
we're authentic.
Yes, it's very hard to negotiate the two. And so, yes, I open the floor to any one of the speakers who would like to say something about this. Yeah. Yes, Renata.
So, Nadia, I usually, I'll call it a defense mechanism for this. And I know that everybody, different people have different ways of thinking about it, but I will, in the same way that I started off saying I'm an engineer, I will start off saying I'm an engineer, I'm thinking in a very left brain way. And so I'm probably going to share things in a way that's going to be very regimented or very direct. And let me share some of my points, and then let's see if we have some areas where there's some misunderstandings, or we can have some conversation. And that seems to help. At the same time, it also, I have found, helps to have a lot of the, and there's another word for it, I call them backdoor conversations, but a lot of those office conversations that are one-on-one, that are relationship building, if possible, ahead of time, so that there are relationships that are built prior to at least getting into the big meetings, so that there's a team, if you will, silent or otherwise, going in, on the same point, or with the similar agenda.
I think it's not an easy thing to do, and it takes experience as well to learn how to find your own way of dealing with these things. Jemima, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes, I'm sure. That was a really good question, Nadia.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's I think it tends to help if your institution is all on board with, say, cultural competencies, and recognizing and celebrating the diversity that is across all the campuses, and not just with staff, but with our students as well. For instance, just a little example, we celebrate all the Pacific language weeks, and we get the whole institution to celebrate that with us. And that also increases our profile with our external stakeholders, the community outside academia, and getting some ministries on board. Yeah, it's that building that sense of community and celebrating people's, I don't like to say difference, because it's not about difference, celebrating people's backgrounds and their authenticity. Oh my goodness, it's it's 2:00. I need coffee. 2:00 p.m. And I've come to realize, although very late in my leadership role, and it's come about because of confronting situations, and that is, with no disrespect to your peers or anyone around you, is not to care what people think. Like, if they consider you the brown, angry woman in the room, that's their definition of it. That is not yours. And so I wouldn't take that on. I would allow them to define it as they will. Yeah, it's about turning everything into positives for me.
Yeah, not giving in, to your own personal beliefs, I think. Yeah. I think we have like three minutes. I don't see any hands. We do have a question in the chat, which I'm gonna read out. And this is addressed to Dr. Tao. And Dr. Tao, do you have suggestions for how to go about having these backdoor conversations that you talked about, right? The asides. In Malay, we say PM tepi, which is like private message at the side, before or ahead. I think that's a really useful strategy. So could you maybe tell us a little bit more?
I will. So interestingly enough, I had a staff meeting today, and I was telling the members of my leadership team that they should feel empowered to utilize spaces that they're already in, committees that they're already on, to help to build relationships with people on those committees, that they shouldn't just be there to take up space, but that they should not only contribute, but also build relationships with the people on those teams. And so one of the things that I had to learn early on was, and I learned this actually at a conference for aspiring women leaders. I think I was in Alaska or something, but there was a conference, and they told us specifically, they said, as women, you need to build relationships with people. So in your regular meetings, sit in different places when you're first starting, and talk to the person to the left of you and to the right of you at every meeting, and rotate around. They said people will have their spaces where they want to sit, but they're not going to move you out of a seat around the table if you sit there. And then over time, you'll find like where you want to sit, and maybe, you know, a colleague that you really gel with, and you can move your seat. But I learned that process really early, and that was really helpful for then the follow-up and the side conversation, the going to a meeting early to say hello to people, introduce yourself, and have those conversations. When I was a new professor, I went to my colleagues' offices. I would stop by and kind of knock on the door and say hello, introduce myself, find something that we had a mutual interest in. And so I've continued to do that throughout my career in various ways.
Yeah.
And I have found that that's very helpful. And in places where I don't know someone or it seems difficult, then I would ask one of my colleagues who I know had a better relationship if they could help to literally kind of broker a deal for me. Can you introduce me? Can I go with you to this meeting? Can I walk with you because I know you're going to be in a meeting with this person, and can you introduce me? And I found people along the way who were willing to serve in that role. They were willing to be a broker. They were willing to be a mentor or a champion or a person who could introduce me into spaces where I currently wasn't. And I've been very grateful to them along the way, but I've learned to do that, and then consequently to do that for others.
Thank you so much for that. And Thomas, yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, I totally endorse this. You know, I think it's important to see that this is shouldn't be like a passive process. So it's really about everybody's responsibility to go out to seek communication with you know, other members of a team, for example. I would also say that empathy is an important point here, to be, you know, show empathy towards the concerns of others, to show interest to what other colleagues do, even if it's not close to your own area of interest or so, but it creates a bond. And also the important thing that Renata just mentioned, they're always like people who can broker a relationship. So some people have you know, better relationships or with some team members or so, and then they can help to facilitate communication. And I think, but it's really I think something you have to work on a daily basis, not something you can expect that happens by itself.
Yes. So communication and negotiation skills, this takes work, guys. And I think we have lots of lessons today, you know, from being authentic to yourself, to the situation, being transparent, you know, preparing yourself, having respect for yourself and also for others. I think that question of being prepared has many angles that we learned from all our three speakers. So thank you very much to our three wonderful panelists today. And of course, to all of you who are participating, who've been listening in. And I'm sure we can continue now. So I hope that you will continue the conversations we've had and you know, some of the points that were raised in your own experiences in our informal networking breakout session. So with that, I will hand over the session to Chelsea Hawes, the APWiL Mentoring Program Manager, to introduce the informal networking session. But before that, maybe a big clap, virtual claps for our three wonderful speakers. Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone.